TomDispatch.com, this is Tomcast. Interviews and insight from Tom Dispatch contributors for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of our post-9/11 world and a clear sense of how our global imperial system actually works. I'm Timothy McBain. Recently, I had the pleasure of sitting down with civil rights lawyer Chase Madar, who discussed the case of Omar Khadr, a Canadian citizen who was captured in 2002 outside of Kabul, tortured at Bagram, and is still being held at Guantanamo Bay. Madar made the case that U.S. prisons have more in common with Guantanamo than most Americans would like to believe.
Now, we tell ourselves in the United States a rather comforting story that what happens at Guantanamo is some kind of unique aberration, a betrayal of American values, something completely different from what one Guantanamo defense lawyer called the Cadillac system of justice that we Americans get here. What happens at Guantanamo is not so much a radical break, but in many ways just a continuation of our everyday criminal justice and penal policies that we have going here at home. Now, we can start with the example of a 15-year-old being tried for murder as in violation of the laws of war and other serious crimes. In much of the world, this seems extraordinarily harsh. This was, by the way, or would have been, had it not been for the plea deal, the first trial of a child soldier since World War II. And in America, there's been a lot of sympathy that's welled up for child soldiers and their plight over the past few years. But that sympathy is completely evaporated for young Omar Khadr. And this isn't as hypocritical as it seems, because what we have here is just a continuation of our regular, everyday policy that we have in America of prosecuting teenagers, minors, as adults. We prosecute 15-year-olds as adults frequently, all the time. I talked with one member of the prosecution team, a former DOJ lawyer, David Iglesias, very nice guy. He couldn't understand what the fuss was about with these child soldiers. He, when he had worked for the Department of Justice as a U.S. attorney in New Mexico, had had to lead prosecutions against 15-year-olds a few times and 16-year-olds. This is just what we do here. We even in America have a couple dozen people doing life without parole for crimes committed when they were 13 or 14. Life without parole for crimes committed when they were 13 or 14. Now, these cases may be controversial sometimes. Not everyone loves them, but I think by and large we've come to accept them in America. Another controversial point about the Omar Khadr case that is in fact quite in step with normal everyday U.S. criminal justice practices is Omar Khadr's harsh interrogation, which I would call torture, and I think most everyone would. When he was taken to Bagram after being captured out on the battlefield in Kabul, he was strung up to the walls of his cell, half naked, with a hood clamped over his head, his arms outstretched like this in just a 5-foot square cell. This was punishment for not complying. He was given veiled threats of rape by his interrogators, who said that if he did not comply and tell them everything they needed to know, he would be sent to an American prison where he would be most likely raped by 4 big black guys and neo-Nazis, and they made up a story of another Afghan youth who they said had that experience. Now, such things go on in the United States quite frequently. They're not legal, but they are more or less a garden variety interrogation tactic. And unfortunately, what we'd like to say, many of us would like to say that this horrible instance of torture is actually quite unique, but no, it has a solid basis. So the use of torture and incredibly coercive and harsh interrogation tactics in the case of Omar Khadr are not so exceptional. Take the case of John Burge, formerly a high-ranking detective in the Chicago Police Department. He will be sentenced on Thursday, November 5th, for the habit he developed of torturing during the case of his interrogations of prisoners in the Chicago Police Department, in the precinct. One of the tortures that he used was his own improvised form of waterboarding. So these things that we like to think are limited only to Guantanamo and to Bagram Prison and Abu Ghraib, really we find examples of them here too. Just last year, Governor Patterson of New York State, his task force investigating the youth detention system in New York State issued a harrowing report full of solid evidence about excessive force being routinely used in New York State's youth detention centers. Shattered teeth, broken bones, even one emotionally disturbed 15-year-old dying after being pinned to the ground, face down, by guards. And it's a little bit strange that I think my fellow liberal-minded New Yorkers might be more aware of what's happening at Guantanamo or what happened at Abu Ghraib than what is happening at the detention centers right here in our own state. Well, we have so many prisoners that I think adhering to all the rules we have is just impossible. So many prisons are overcrowded. With so many prisoners, we're not spending enough for an adequate number of guards or for adequate training of guards, which is perhaps the most important thing. There are alternatives that involve less violence that are used for hard case inmates, but that are used in other countries, but we seem not to want to know about them here, even though they're more cost effective and result in less violence for everyone, guards included. It's also significant that Omar Khadr, after spending a few years in the communal wing of Guantanamo's prison, will now be transferred to solitary confinement, where he will spend at least 1 year, maybe longer. This also happened to the most recent conviction at Guantanamo. This was the cook that Al-Qaeda had. He is doing 2 years in solitary confinement. We in America have not quite caught up to the fact that solitary confinement is a devastating form of torture. I would much rather be waterboarded than placed in solitary confinement for sustained periods. And yet here in America, it's considered nothing scandalous at all. We have over 25,000 prisoners, inmates, doing some form of sustained solitary confinement. And it causes lasting psychological damage and it destroys the mind. So what we're doing in Guantanamo there is really nothing any different from what we're doing here. And by the way, I do not intend this in the least as a defense of Guantanamo or Bagram. I say this to point out how much like Guantanamo, so much of our everyday normal criminal justice system and penal system is already.